When you think of the last name Manning, most people think of Super Bowls, MVP awards, and just pure football greatness. So when the name Arch Manning started to float around the internet in 2019, college football fans couldn't help but pique their interest. Now, 4 years later, Arch is one of the top QB prospects in the nation and is early enrolled in Texas, hoping to bring the Longhorns back to their former football glory. He's the top recruit to arrive in Austin since the legend Vince Young. And Longhorn faithful are hopeful that Arch can bring a championship back to Austin. Today, we're going to jump into Arch's career in NCAA Football 24 and see if we can bring a championship back to Austin. But before we do, slide down beneath the video and make sure to smash that subscribe button. Don't forget the like button too. Well, let's get into it. Arch would open up his career at Texas with their final season in the Big 12. Starting their season with a new conference member BYU would give the Longhorns a test. Arch would struggle to find the end zone consistently through the air, but would show off his athleticism with 3 TDs on the ground, edging out the Cougars 42-35. The Longhorns would play host to Wyoming the next week in a tune-up game that saw the young Manning tally over 400 yards of offense with another total 4 TDs. Texas would barely break a sweat, posting a shutout 56-0 win over the Cowboys. The tune-up week would prove to be much needed as Texas would host number 3 Alabama in what would prove to be Arch's first big test of his career. Manning would start the game hot, finding the end zone on the first drive to put the Longhorns up 7 early. Into the late second quarter, the Longhorns would go up 14-10. Arch showed the legs again, finding Pater to put Texas up 2 scores just before half. However, Alabama would find a way to score twice around the half, giving them a 24-21 lead. And this is when disaster would strike, as Arch would be picked off on the corner route, giving Alabama great field position. Bama would take advantage of the turnover, but Manning would go back to work, leading his team downfield and into field goal position to draw it to a 1-score game. The Longhorns defense would force a stop, giving Arch just enough time to scamper into the end zone with under a minute left to force overtime. However, a costly interception from Arch in the first OT period and a Crimson Tide field goal would hand Texas its first loss of the season. Coming off their first loss of the season, Arch and company would find another top 10 opponent in UCF. But thanks to another 400-yard 4 TD day, Arch would get Texas back on track, but only to be handed an embarrassing 52-14 loss the next week in the Red River rivalry. Knowing that a national championship was unlikely after a second loss, Arch would turn his attention towards bringing home one last Big 12 title and would need to perform perfect the rest of the year to help his team get there. He would start by getting back on the right track versus Rice, showing off his ability to run the ball with over 100 yards and 3 TDs on the ground. The next week would bring the road test against OK State, which would result in a defensive low-scoring affair, but thanks to a late third quarter TD run by Arch, the Longhorns would cruise to a 24-14 win. Finally starting to put together a win streak, Texas would find its rhythm and would carry that into their next game against a staunch Kansas State team. The game would be played pretty close though, leading into a halftime tied at 14. K-State would get the ball first coming at a half and would take the lead on their first possession. And on the first drive of the second half for the Longhorns, Arch would throw a pick to LB Austin Moore, who would take it all the way back and give the Wildcats a 2-score lead. However, Arch Manning would not go away quietly, dialing up a score on the next drive and unleashing a 60-yard bomb midway through the fourth to tie the game back up. But Texas would find themselves in a tough spot once again, down 35-28 with only time for one more play. Arch would drop back and sling it down the right sideline to a wide open Hall, who would run up to the end zone with zeros left on the clock and force OT. And after a missed PAT from K-State, Arch would dial up his 5th TD of the day and clinch the comeback win for the Longhorns, with the PAT being good. Buzzing off the OT win, Texas would try to carry the energy on the road to Iowa State, but would be met by a strong defense in Ames. Arch would struggle heavily through the game, but Texas would still squeak out a 14-13 win. Arch would find his way the next week though, dialing up 6 TDs in an easy win over Old Dominion. Coming off this phenomenal performance, Arch would try to replicate it on the road against Kansas and would do just that with a 5 TD performance in a close game in Lawrence. Manning would repeat that performance once again in Morgantown with another 5 TD performance to close out the regular season. Arch would finish out the regular season with 3,500 passing yards, 700 rushing yards, and 47 total TDs, which was enough for him to become the 3rd freshman and first true freshman to win the Heisman. Texas would also be rewarded with the Rose Bowl appearance against their old rival Texas A&M, but would unfortunately lose in Pasadena 36-7. Arch's sophomore year would present a new challenge as Texas would make the jump to the SEC, which would shake up their schedule with the host of new high-caliber opponents. Before their jump to the SEC play though, Texas would have to take on Notre Dame in South Bend. Things would not start smoothly against the Irish, as Arch would have trouble taking care of the football, resulting in a 14-0 deficit early in the first half. But the Longhorns would respond as Manning found Cook on a 20-yard strike to get Texas on the board. Texas would get a field goal just before half to cut the lead to 14-10. And just out of half, Manning would find Howard to take the lead 17-14. But a Notre Dame touchdown response would put them right back ahead. And Manning would get one more chance to make magic happen and would scamper in for the go-ahead score with just over a minute to play. Unfortunately though, the defense would not hold up, and with the time left on the clock, Texas would drop its first game on the season on the road in South Bend. Texas would remain on the road for the next couple of weeks, first picking up a tight 27-16 win against Arkansas, as Arch added another 3 TDs to his career total. The next week, the Longhorns would make the trip to Death Valley to take on LSU, and Arch would struggle to get the offense going. After posting 14 points in the first half, Texas would not score again until very late in the game, down 2 scores, suffering their second loss of the season in Baton Rouge. After suffering the stinging loss, the Longhorns would fall out of the top 25 and play host to number 7 Alabama. Texas would however come with new energy and would jump out to an early 14-point lead on the Crimson Tide. Alabama would not go away quietly though, holding Texas to 2 scoreless quarters and putting up 14 of their own points to take the lead. Texas would get back in shape with an early 4th quarter score, but Bama would answer back one more time to take the lead. And with just under 2 minutes to play, Arch would lead the Longhorns down the field for one final score to clinch the game and put Texas back on track. Arch and company would breeze through the next couple of weeks, posting easy wins over Auburn and Cal, while Arch dialed up 600 yards and 9 TDs over the 2-week span. This would give Texas the momentum they needed with the Red River rivalry coming up. Texas would get off to a slow start against the Sooners, falling behind 14-0, but would dial up a long TD just before half to cut the OU lead to 7. The Texas defense would step up in this game to shut down the Sooner offense for the rest of the game, allowing the Longhorns to retake the lead midway through the 4th, and then finally sealing it with a late TD scamper from Arch, getting their revenge on the Sooners. Kentucky would present yet another challenge to this Texas team, playing a tight game all the way down to the wire. It would require a late game heroic from Arch to set his squad up with a field goal opportunity in the waning seconds of the game. This game would seem to take it out of the Longhorns though, as they would come out flat, falling at TCU the next week. The next couple of weeks would see a couple of lower scoring affairs. A rainy game in Starkville would slow the offense just a bit, but not stop Texas from securing a big win on the road. However, the elements would not be the problem the next week, as Arch and company would fall just short in a 10-7 defensive slugfest against Texas A&M. Coming off their loss to A&M, Texas would look to bounce back against a strong Ole Miss squad. Arch would start the game off hot, but it would turn into a tight contest, with Arch throwing a late TD to give the Longhorns the win in their final game of the regular season. After a disappointing sophomore season, Arch would look to bounce back in his junior year, as he still had the goal of a championship on his mind, as well as the potential of his NFL draft eligibility. The road to accomplishing these goals would start in Colorado against Deion Sanders and the Buffaloes. Deion would have a squad ready to play though, taking an early lead, but the talent of the Texas squad would be too much and they would score 28 unanswered points to take home the win in Boulder. Texas would open their second campaign in SEC play hosting the Razorbacks, and despite some close moments, the Longhorns would manage to cruise to a 45-24 win off the arm of Arch. The boys in burnt orange would continue their dominance into the next week, getting their revenge on LSU in a shutout win 28-0. The Texas train of dominance would stop in Tuscaloosa, however, as the Crimson Tide would shred Texas in a highly anticipated conference matchup. Manning would struggle to find the end zone as the Longhorns would fall 38-21. Returning to the state of Alabama the following week, Arch and company would find much better luck after a tight game with Auburn. In the final minutes of the 4th quarter, Arch would find Aaron Whitaker for a 62-yard TD, helping Texas secure their 4th win of the season and gaining back some momentum. This year's Red River rivalry would turn out to be a snoozer of a game, as Arch would fail to find the end zone, but would lead the Longhorns to a 7-0 win. Arch would however get back on track the following week with a 5 TD performance to give Texas the comfortable win over BYU. The Texas offense would return to being lethargic the following week as they would take on Kentucky, but the clutch gene in Arch would still remain present. Finding themselves down 14-10 with just over a minute remaining, Arch would connect with his man Aaron Whitaker to give Texas the lead and eventually win as the Longhorns would continue to roll. The offense would find its rhythm once again the following week against Mississippi State, dialing up 31 points in an easy win. With the win streak at their back, Arch and company would feel great heading into a classic matchup against number 6 Texas A&M. The Longhorns would start fast and never look back, handing the Aggies a crushing 34-14 loss. And with their toughest remaining conference game handled, Texas would just need to focus on Ole Miss for a berth in the SEC championship. Ole Miss would prove to be no problem as they would cruise past the Rebels and Notre Dame the following week to finish the season with just one loss and a chance at a championship. Texas would enter SEC championship week with the number 2 ranking in the country and a legit shot at playing for a national title, but they would need to take care of business against Kentucky first. Texas would fall behind 7-0 early but would respond with 14 unanswered before Kentucky drew it back to a tie just before half. And on the first Longhorn possession in the second half, Arch would make a costly mistake, turning it over to the Wildcats, allowing them to take the lead. Texas would rally from this though, finding a score late in the third to tie the game back up. The two teams would battle throughout most of the fourth, resulting in a 28-28 tie with less than 2 minutes to play. But Arch would take his team down the field one final time to cash in the TD with 37 to play, giving Texas their first SEC championship. Coming off a huge SEC title win, Texas would be ranked number 3 and would start play in the inaugural 12-team college football playoff. For their number 3 ranking, they were rewarded with a bye and playing the eventual winner of Georgia and Virginia Tech. BT would actually end up upsetting Georgia, setting up for a showdown with Texas in their first college football playoff game. Texas would take on the Hokies in Arlington and would play the game closely through the first half until Texas was able to break it open in the fourth quarter. In the early minutes of the quarter, Arch would find Carl Brown for the 38-yard score to give the Longhorns a 3-score lead and eventual win. The win over VT would advance the Longhorns to the next round where they would square off against number 4 Penn State in the Fiesta Bowl. Texas would unfortunately come out flat as they would fall behind 2 scores in the first half and would never catch up again. Arch would struggle on the day, surrendering 3 picks, which would bring an end to the Texas National Championship bid. Arch would end up finishing his junior season with over 11,000 career offensive yards and 117 TDs. That would solidly land him in the first 2 days of the draft, and as much as he wanted to come back and bring a natty to Austin, the temptation to go to the NFL was too great. The former Heisman winner would forgo his senior season and enter the 2026 draft. But what pick do you think Arch would be selected at? And to what team? Do you think he could live up to his uncle's legacies? Let us know down in the comments below. And if you enjoyed the video, man, maybe check this one out, where I dive into Shedeur Sanders' career at Colorado.